The warden's bell rang 3 times over the lower concourse of Calyx Reach, and every voiceless within sight of the sound went still where they stood, the way grass goes still before a wind nobody else can feel yet. Alys Ferro felt it too, a half-second late, the way she always did. She had been walking the ration line toward the annex commissary with a data slate under her arm, and now she stopped along with everyone else near the rail, because stopping was the rule, and because not stopping drew eyes, and because eyes on a human this close to a correction were the last thing the Threnn Compact Liaison Office needed 9 days before the 3rd renewal. 2 levels down, on the open plaza where the concourse widened around a dry fountain nobody living remembered running, a hand of correction in gray lacquer stood over a kneeling figure with no face Alys could make out from this height and no name anyone would ever say aloud. The offense, according to the notice board that would update itself in an hour with a glyph and a number, would be something small. A dropped tray. A held gaze 1 second too long. A door opened before it was ordered opened. It did not especially matter which. What mattered was that it happened where the numbered could see it, on a schedule regular enough to keep the numbers small and afraid, and that everyone else, blood-marked, named guest species, human, learned to let their eyes slide past it like weather. Alys made herself watch for exactly as long as protocol required, which was not long enough to matter, and was somehow also the longest 4 seconds of every week. Then the bell rang once more, sharp, final, and the concourse exhaled and went back to moving, and Alys made herself move with it, because Ambassador Dresden had told her on her 2nd day at Calyx Reach, in the gentlest voice he owned, that the very first skill a Threnn needed here was learning to keep walking. She had been keeping walking for 14 months. She was not sure anymore if it counted as a skill or a wound that had simply stopped bleeding where people could see it. The embassy annex occupied 4 converted cargo decks near the Reach's spinward docking arm, humbler by a wide margin than the Threnn Dominion's other guest species wings, which suited the size of the Threnn Compact's actual standing in this part of the galaxy. Small, provisional, watched. Alys badged through the outer seal, nodded to the 2 named clerks on desk duty, and took the lift down to the translation pool, where she spent most of her days turning trade manifests and diplomatic cables between Threnn Court Formal and Compact Standard, work that mattered enormously to the people who read the finished documents and to almost no one who wrote them. Her desk sat in the corner nearest the maintenance grate, which was, she had decided long ago, the best desk in the pool, because it was the only one Hearth9 could reach without being seen doing it. The scrap was there when she arrived, folded into quarters and tucked under the base of her lamp, the way it always was on the mornings 9 had cleaning rotation in this wing. Alys did not open it at her desk. She never did. She carried it to the refresher at the end of the corridor, locked the door, and only then unfolded the thin gray fiber cloth, the kind used to wipe consoles, cheap and disposable and therefore never counted, never missed, and read the 6 words 9 had traced onto it in charcoal dust lifted from a spent filter cartridge. The ship word for going home. Alys smiled before she could stop herself, and then made herself stop, because smiling in a refresher mirror over 6 charcoal words was not something a Threnn liaison clerk could explain if anyone ever asked her to. It had started 11 months ago with nothing more than pity, if she was honest with herself, and pity was not a word she liked using about 9, because pity implied 9 needed rescuing, and 9 had never once behaved like someone waiting to be rescued. It had started with Alys leaving her lunch half-finished on purpose on the day's 9's rotation, cross the translation pool, because the ration allotment for voiceless labor was calculated. She had learned from a supply manifest she was never meant to read closely, at 11% below minimum sustaining calorie need for adult Threnn-adjacent physiology, on the theory that a servant kept a little hungry stayed a little humble. It had become something else the day Alys came back from the refresher to find 9 had used the crumbs on her plate to trace, very carefully, in a spiral around the rim, the 7 characters of the Threnn glyph for asterisk thank you. A glyph no Voiceless was permitted to write, because writing was a named privilege and a blood-marked birthright, and nothing a servant needed to survive scrubbing floors. Alys had looked at that spiral of crumbs for a long time. Then she had gone and found a spent filter cartridge. Because charcoal dust left no residue a scanner would flag and no ink a supply audit would trace, and she had shown 9, in the 6 minutes before the next patrol swept the pool, how to hold it. 11 months, 6 minutes at a time, into 6 words about the word for going home. She did not know, until that morning, that 9 had been thinking about home. The first lesson had nearly gotten them both caught, and Alys still thought about that morning more than she let herself admit. She had shown 9 the shape of a single character, the Threnn glyph for asterisk water asterisk, chosen because it was simple, and because a cleaning cart carried water and no one would look twice at a servant standing near a basin, and had looked up mid-stroke to find Overseer Thane's predecessor, a heavier, lazier man named Corv who had since rotated off station, standing in the pool's doorway with a data slate under his arm. Alys had frozen. 9 had not. She had let the charcoal stick slip from her fingers and clatter to the deck, dropped to one knee to retrieve it with the flat, practiced haste of someone fumbling a tool rather than concealing a lesson. And by the time Corv's eyes tracked the sound, she was already back at the terminal with her cart, scrubbing a console that did not need scrubbing. And Alys had gone back to her manifest with her heart slamming so hard she was certain the whole pool could hear it. Corv had grunted something about efficiency and moved on. 9 had not looked at Alys again for the rest of that shift, and that night, tucked into the drawer under the lamp, the first scrap of gray cloth had appeared. Not a word, not yet, just the glyph for asterisk water traced clean and confident. 3 more times than it needed to be, as if to say I have it now, it was worth the risk. That had been the pattern ever since. A glyph, a risk, a small, private proof that the risk had been worth taking. Alys had told herself in the earliest months that she was only being kind, the way she might have been kind to anyone who worked hard and ate too little, a decent instinct, nothing more complicated than that, easy to justify to herself in the language of ordinary compassion. It had stopped being that simple somewhere around the 4th month. The day 9 had used her scraps of vocabulary, painstaking and imperfect, to leave a message that was not a word at all but a question. 3 characters, badly formed, meaning roughly asterisk why do you asterisk? Not asterisk why do you teach me? Just asterisk why do you asterisk? Unfinished, as if 9 herself had not been sure which ending belonged on it. And Alys had sat with that unfinished question for 3 days before she understood that she did not actually have an answer that fit in 6 minutes, and that the not having an answer was itself the answer, because by then it was no longer a kindness she was extending downward from a position of safety. It was a friendship, conducted in stolen minutes and charcoal dust. Between 2 people, the Dominion's ledgers would never once record as having anything in common. She folded the cloth back into quarters, tucked it into the lining of her sleeve where it would ride against her skin, until she could burn it in the incinerator chute on the walk to lunch, and went back to her desk to translate a shipping manifest into a language for cargo that was not, in the end, all that different from the language for people. The notice about the Empress's arrival came down from the ambassador's office at 0940, forwarded through 6 layers of diplomatic phrasing before it reached the translation pool, but the substance of it took Alys about 4 seconds to extract. Empress Soreth Vantane, ascended 8 months prior after the still unexplained death of her mother, would preside in person over the 3rd renewal ceremony for the Calyx Accord, her first sovereign appearance beyond the Dominion capital since the coronation. Lord Chancellor Doran Vext, who had governed as regent steward through the transition and who had, by every account Alys had ever translated, governed rather more comfortably than he was now being asked to stop, would arrive 4 days ahead of her to oversee preparations. Preparations, Ambassador Dresden said that afternoon, standing at the head of the pool with the specific weariness of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read what alien bureaucracies meant instead of what they said. Means the Chancellor intends to remind everyone on this station, including us, exactly whose authority still runs it. Keep your heads down. Keep the translations clean. This renewal is not guaranteed, people. The compact has one toehold in Threnn space, and it is this one, and it survives because we make ourselves useful and we make ourselves quiet. 4 days. Alys kept her head down for one of them. On the second day, Overseer Calyx Threnn came through the annex on an inspection tour that no one had scheduled, and no one could refuse, trailing 2 blood-marked aides and a data collar reader that hummed faintly as it passed near every Voiceless in the building, cataloging them against a household ledger the way a rancher counts stock before a buyer's visit. Threnn was vexed, man. Everyone in the pool knew that without anyone saying it, on loan to oversee the annex's numbered staff for the duration of the renewal preparations, and he moved through the translation pool with the unhurried, proprietary interest of someone deciding what to keep and what to cull before an inventory. He stopped at Hearth 9. Alys did not look up from her slate. She had trained herself over 11 months not to look up, because looking up was a tell, and tells got people killed on Calyx Reach, just not usually the people who gave them. This one, Threnn said to no one and everyone reading the collar. 4th rotation, long assignment for a floor scrubber. Your Voiceless don't usually last past the 3rd. She's efficient, said the pool supervisor, a named clerk named Orsa who had no particular love for 9 or hate for her either, who simply wanted Threnn's attention somewhere else. No incidents logged. Threnn crouched, which was, Alys understood with a slow, cold drop in her stomach, not a thing overseers did for efficient furniture. He was looking at the data terminal beside 9's cleaning cart, where a supply requisition form sat half-completed on the screen, waiting for a named clerk's signature to release replacement filter cartridges to the annex's maintenance stock. The requisition number in the corner had been transposed, a simple clerical slip, the kind that happened 40 times a day across the annex, except that beside it, in the margin where the autofill routine had failed to populate the corrected digits, 6 characters had been traced into the dust on the touch glass. Not typed. Traced, in a hand still learning its own weight, the loop of the 2nd character dragging slightly too long the way Alys' own charcoal demonstrations always dragged when she was rushing. The Threnn glyph for correct asterisk. Threnn straightened up very slowly. Whose station is this? He said, and it was not a question, and the pool went silent, the particular silence Alys had learned to recognize as the sound of a room deciding, individually and at speed, exactly how far away from a coming blast radius it could get. Mine, Alys said before 9 could be asked, before the moment could resolve itself into a shape Alys would spend the rest of her life regretting. The touch glass is a shared terminal. Half the pool uses it. I was training on Threnn correction glyphs last week. For the trade manifests, I must have left the trace up. It was, as lies went thin. It required Threnn to believe that a Terran liaison clerk practiced Threnn script on a public terminal, and then walked away without clearing it. And it required him not to notice that the hand that had traced those 6 characters had never once, in any of the annex's records, been taught to hold a stylus. Threnn looked at Alys for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Hearth 9, who had not moved, who had kept her eyes on the floor tile in front of her cart the entire time with the flat stillness of someone who had survived 11 correction bells by becoming furniture on command, and something in his expression, not doubt, exactly, something colder and more patient than doubt, settled into place. Efficient, he said again, and this time it did not sound like a compliment. He straightened, tapped the collar reader once against 9's wristmark, and moved on down the row without another word, and it was not until he had cleared the pool entirely that Alys realized she had been holding her breath since the word asterisk correct asterisk. Overseer Threnn brought the requisition terminal's capture log to Chancellor Vext's temporary chambers that same evening, and laid it on the low table between them, with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood exactly what his patron wanted before his patron had finished asking for it. "A Voiceless in the Terran Annex," Threnn said, tracing correction glyphs on a shared terminal. The clerk claimed the trace was her own practice work, which I am confident is a lie, Chancellor, though I could not prove it on the spot without a formal literacy assay, which would have required detaining the servant in front of the entire pool. Vext studied the captured image for a long moment, turning it in the light the way a jeweler turns a stone to find the flaw that will let him talk the price down. "You did well not to force it there," he said. "A quiet detainment in a translation pool proves nothing to anyone who matters. What I need proves something to everyone who matters, at the 1 hour when everyone who matters will already be watching." He set the slate down. "The renewal ceremony. Chancellor, the optics of a correction during the opening rite are precisely the optics I require." Vext rose and crossed to the chamber's narrow viewport, where Calyx Reach's docking arm curved away into starlight, freight haulers crawling along it like slow insects. "The new Empress has spent 8 months being managed by court members who remember what her mother built and are frightened of what an untested girl might unbuild by accident. I am not frightened of that, Threnn. I am counting on it. Soreth Vantane has never once, in her sheltered life, been made to watch what this order actually requires to hold together. I intend to show her, on the morning she believes she is merely renewing a trade agreement, precisely what throne she has inherited, and I intend the Terrans to watch it happen at the same moment, so that whatever fondness that clerk has developed for her little project curdles into the fear a guest species is supposed to carry. Fear keeps guests polite. Fondness makes them reckless." He turned back, and something in his expression, Threnn thought, resembled a man already rehearsing a eulogy he expected to deliver for someone else's authority. "Flag the servant for correction. Schedule it for the opening rite. And Threnn, say nothing to anyone about how thin the evidence actually is. Evidence is not the point of a demonstration. The demonstration is the point of the demonstration." Threnn inclined his head and withdrew, and did not ask, because it was not his place to ask, what precisely the Chancellor meant to demonstrate to a throne he had governed alone for 8 months and had shown, in 100 small unspoken ways since the coronation, no particular hurry to relinquish. The summons for Ambassador Dresden's office came the following morning, and it was not addressed to 9. Alys read the notice twice before the meaning of it settled all the way in, because the Threnn court formal it was written in buried the substance 3 clauses deep the way it always did, wrapping the actual sentence, Hearth Designate 9, Household Registry Annex 4, flagged for correction pending confirmation of unauthorized literacy, inside a shell of ceremonial phrasing about the sanctity of caste order and the honor of the coming renewal. The correction was scheduled for the morning of the ceremony itself, not privately, not administratively, not in the lower concourse at the ordinary hour with the ordinary bell. Publicly, on the ceremonial dais at the front of the assembled court, immediately before the Empress and the Chancellor formally opened the 3rd renewal proceedings. A demonstration, the notice said, of the Dominion's unwavering commitment to lawful order at a moment when lawful order was, by clear implication, precisely the thing every guest species on the station had been invited to observe and remember. Alys understood the shape of it within 30 seconds of finishing the translation. This was never really about a mistranscribed requisition form. Threnn had gone looking for something to hand Vext, and Vext had found something better than he'd hoped. A Voiceless in the human annex who could read, evidence, however thin, however circumstantial, that a guest species was corrupting Dominion order from inside its own household, staged for maximum visibility at the exact moment the Chancellor most wanted to remind a new Empress, and a nervous foreign delegation, and his own restless court, that nothing about the old order had softened just because the old Empress was dead. She went to Dresden's office without an appointment and without, for the first time in 14 months, knocking first. "I need you to intervene," she said. Dresden did not look up from the cable he was drafting for another 30 seconds, which she understood, even through the roar in her ears, was its own kind of answer. "No," he said finally, setting down his stylus. "Sit down, Ferro." She did not sit down. "She's being executed on a public dais in front of the entire Threnn court because a form got traced wrong on a terminal I use every day. That's not a caste violation, that's a message, and it's not even a message meant for her." "I know exactly what it's a message for," Dresden said, and something in his voice, tired and precise, told her he had already run every version of this conversation in his own head before she'd walked in. "It's a message for us. Vext wants the Terran delegation to watch what happens to things it grows fond of, 4 days before he needs us frightened and compliant during the single most delicate diplomatic act this office has attempted in 3 years. And it is working, Ferro, because you are standing in my office instead of at your desk. So we let her die. We do not have jurisdiction over Dominion internal caste law," Dresden said, each word set down like a stone laid in a wall he had built a long time ago and had learned to live behind. "We have never had jurisdiction over Dominion internal caste law. It is the single-line item in the Accord we are explicitly barred from raising, because the Dominion made clear at first Renewal that any Terran interference in caste matters would be read as a hostile act against sovereign order, and a hostile act 4 days before a Renewal vote does not put one servant at risk. It puts every human being currently living, working, or stationed anywhere in Threnn space at risk. 40,000 of us, Ferro. On a toehold this fragile, that vote does not need much to go the other way. She traced my characters, I taught her. If anyone actually looked." "Then do not let anyone actually look," Dresden said, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly, not with anger but with something closer to grief, an old man who had clearly liked this particular clerk a great deal and was now watching her walk toward the exact edge he had spent 30 years teaching people not to walk toward. "I am not telling you this because I don't understand what you feel. I am telling you this because I have watched good people lose everything trying to fix one wrong thing on a board where the whole game is rigged to punish exactly that impulse. You will not save her by intervening. You will lose your post, your status, likely your freedom, and you will hand Vext a Terran hostile act to wave in front of the Empress at the exact moment he wants one. The Accord could die on that floor with her. Do you understand what that means? Not just for you. For every one of us out here." Alys stood very still in the doorway of his office, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like thought than like something breaking loose and dropping through her, that he was not wrong about a single fact he had just laid out, and that none of those facts were going to change what she did next. "Yes, sir," she said, because it was the only answer that would let her leave the room, and left. She spent that night and the next trying every quieter door first, because she was not reckless, whatever the record would eventually say about her. She drafted a formal petition to purchase Nine's debt bond outright, offering the entirety of her contract savings and 4 years of future salary against it, and had it returned within the hour by the Household Registry Office with a notation that correction-flagged assets were not eligible for transfer, a fact she should have already known, and had let herself forget because hope made people stupid about paperwork. Between the 2 attempts, she went to the one blood-marked contact the Annex kept on friendly terms, a minor court functionary named Lady Farron Osk, whose house handled a portion of the Compact's cargo licensing, and who had, on 3 prior occasions, done small favors for Dresden's office in exchange for Terran engineering, Advice her house's aging freighters badly needed. Alys found her in the licensing gallery 2 decks up, and laid the whole of it out in a rushed, low voice she was careful to keep beneath the notice of the clerks working the counters nearby. The mistranscribed form, the 6 letters, the dais scheduled 4 days out. Lady Osk listened with her hands folded, and her face carefully arranged into the polite stillness of someone who had heard a great many petitions, and had long ago learned which ones to let land and which to let slide past. When Alys finished, she was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for Alys to feel a small, unwarranted flicker of hope. "My house holds 40 voiceless on 3 estates," Lady Osk said finally, gently, the way you might explain a cliff's edge to someone already standing too close to it. "I did not choose that arrangement. I inherited it, the way I inherited the debts that would sink my house within a season if that labor disappeared tomorrow. If I speak for a servant's clemency on the floor of the renewal ceremony, I'm not merely embarrassing myself, Threnn. I am telling every other house with Voiceless on its books that Threnn Osk believes the arrangement is worth questioning aloud, in public, 4 days before a vote that decides whether her own cargo licenses survive the season. I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry. I have watched that particular bell ring more times than I care to count, and I have never once liked the sound of it. But I cannot be the house that says so first. No one wants to be the house that says so first." "Someone has to be the house that says so first," Alys said, "or nothing ever changes." "Then let it be someone with less to lose than I have," Lady Osk said, not unkindly, and returned to her ledgers, and Alys walked back down to the annex with that sentence sitting in her chest like a stone, because she understood, by the time she reached her own desk, exactly whose name Lady Osk's sentence had just quietly, accidentally, pointed toward. She tried, on the second night, to draft a plan to move 9 off the station entirely, through the maintenance conduits that ran beneath the annex to the freight docks, where a compact supply runner left every 3rd day for the relay at Kessen's anchor, and got exactly as far as laying it out, in a whisper, in the refresher with the water running to cover their voices, before 9 shook her head. "They will check the manifest against the collar count within the hour," 9 said. It was the most words Alys had ever heard her say aloud, low and careful, the accent of someone who had learned Threnn's standard as a captured tongue rather than a native one. "They will find one missing. They will not look for me on a supply runner. They will look at you. And when they find you gone with me, it will not be correction anymore. It will be an incident. It will be the thing your ambassador is afraid of, and it will be my name on the manifest that caused it." "You don't have a name," Alys said, and heard how it sounded the instant it left her mouth, and 9, astonishingly, almost smiled. "I have a name," she said. "It is only that no one here has ever asked to use it." "Tell me." 9 looked at her for a long moment in the dim refresher light, water running uselessly into the drain between them, and something moved across her face that was not quite trust and not quite grief and was, Alys thought later, both of those things wearing the same expression because there had simply never been room to tell them apart. "Sael," she said. "My mother named me Sael, before the debt bond, before the registry. It is not written anywhere they would find it." "Sael," Alys repeated, and it felt, saying it, like handing something back across a distance that should never have existed in the first place. "I'm not letting you die with a number instead of that." "You are not letting anything," Sael said, gently, the way you correct a child who has understood the feeling of a situation but not its shape. "There is no version of this where you decide what happens to me on that dais. There is only a version where you are standing beside me when it happens, or a version where you are not. I would rather you were not. I have watched what happens to people who stand where they are not permitted to stand. It does not save the ones on the ground. It only adds one more. Then I'll find another way." Alys. It was the first time Sael had ever used her name instead of a title, and it stopped her cold in a way 3 days of Ambassador Dresden's careful warnings had not managed. "There is no other way. There has never been another way. I have watched 11 corrections since they brought me to this station, and every single one of them, someone somewhere was certain there would be another way, right up until the bell. Alys did not have an answer for that. She stood in the refresher with the water running and let the silence sit between them, and somewhere behind her ribs, underneath the grief and the fear and the useless, circling anger, something else was beginning to take shape, small and cold, and entirely without a plan attached to it yet. The flat, simple certainty that whatever else happened on that dais, she was not going to be one more person a long way from the ground, watching. Empress Sareth Vantane had been aboard Calyx Reach for 6 hours, and had not yet been permitted to sit down without an aide within arm's reach, and she was beginning to understand, with the slow, dawning clarity of someone finally seeing a familiar room's furniture rearranged around her, that this was itself a kind of message. The household registry audit for the Annex District, Chancellor Vext was saying, walking half a pace ahead of her through the ceremonial gallery in the particular way he had of leading a conversation by leading the room it happened in, flagged an irregularity 3 days ago. A Voiceless attached to the Threnn liaison offices, exhibiting unauthorized literacy. We will address it during the opening rites, before the renewal vote, a small matter, Majesty, but symbolically useful. It reminds the court, and our guests, that the order which has held this dominion together for 1100 years did not end when your mother did. Sareth had learned, in 8 months of being Empress in name, and something considerably less than that in practice, to hear the second sentence hiding inside every one of Vext's first sentences. Your mother was doing a great deal of work in that particular formulation, and she let it pass across her without changing her expression, because she had also learned that giving Vext a reaction was the same as handing him a lever. A servant traced some letters, she said. You want to open my first sovereign renewal ceremony with an execution. A correction, Vext said, mild as still water. The distinction matters, Majesty. To the 1100 years of law we are both sworn to. And the Threnn delegation, you've thought about how they'll read it. I have thought about it a great deal, Vext said, and for the first time something almost like warmth entered his voice, the warmth of a man discussing his favorite subject. It is precisely the audience I want. The Threnns are new, Majesty, and new species mistake our patience for softness. They will watch us hold to our own order on the morning we renew theirs, and they will understand, correctly, exactly what kind of house they are guests in. It is a kindness in its way. Clarity prevents far worse misunderstandings later. Sareth said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that would move him, and because she had learned that too in 8 months. That arguing with Vext in front of witnesses only handed him a longer speech to make. She let him walk her the rest of the way to the guest quarters prepared for her, and once the doors sealed and the aides withdrew to the antechamber and she was, for the first time in 6 hours, entirely alone, she stood in the middle of the room and let her shoulders drop half a degree, which was the closest thing to rest she had allowed herself since the shuttle docked. Her mother had governed for 31 years and had died in a corridor 6 decks from the throne room, in the middle of the night, of what the official record called a cardiac irregularity, and what every serious person in the capital privately understood to be poison, administered by someone with access no ordinary assassin should have had. No one had ever been charged. Vext had governed the 8-month interregnum with an efficiency that had struck Sareth, at the time, as reassuring, and struck her now, standing alone in a borrowed room on a station 4 days from home, as something considerably colder. The efficiency of a man who had already rehearsed the role once and had not entirely relinquished it. She had ascended a dominion that ran, by law and by custom, and by 1100 years of unbroken practice, on the strict ordering of blood-marked over-named over Voiceless, an order so old it did not feel like a choice to most of the people living inside it, the way weather does not feel like a choice. She had grown up inside a household with 40 Voiceless in it and had known, distantly, the way you know a fact about a country you have never visited, that correction happened, that it happened often, that it was not something a blood-marked child was meant to think about closely. She had not thought about it closely. She had been taught not to. She understood now, standing in the quiet of the guest quarters with Vext's plan settling over her like a held breath, that this had been the entire point of the teaching. She thought distantly about the servant who traced letters into dust because no one had ever offered her a page. She did not yet know the name Sael. She would not learn it for 2 more days, and when she did, it would already be too late to change anything about how she first came to hear it, which was screaming, in a language she did not speak, from the mouth of a Terran clerk who had crossed a line no one crossed and lived. Dresden found Alys in the translation pool past midnight, the night before the ceremony, sitting at her desk with the lamp off and both hands flat on the surface, as if she were holding it down against something trying to lift it. "You should sleep," he said, which was not what either of them meant, and they both knew it. "I keep running the numbers you gave me," Alys said. 40,000 Terrans, 14 years of standing, 1 clerk's outburst. She looked up at him. "You're not here to tell me to stay in my seat tomorrow, are you?" "No," Dresden said, and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. An old man who had spent 30 years building the exact caution he was about to set aside for a single afternoon. "I am here because I have decided that if you go down onto that floor tomorrow, this office is not going to pretend afterward that it did not know what you intended, or that it disapproved, or that it was somehow unable to help. I built my entire career on the theory that quiet was the only thing that kept us safe out here. I am no longer certain that theory was ever true, or only that it was true for exactly as long as no one tested it. I would like to know, before you walk onto that floor tomorrow, that if the Accord survives this, it will survive because we finally tested it honestly, not because we hid from the test. And if it doesn't survive, then it was never going to survive contact with a single hard truth," Dresden said, "and better we learn that now with 1 clerk's life on the line than in 20 years with a war on the line instead." He rose slow and paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Ferro, I do not think you are being reckless. I have watched reckless people. Reckless people do not spend 3 nights trying every quiet door first. You did the quiet work. Tomorrow is simply what is left when the quiet work runs out." He left her alone with the dark pool and the folded gray scrap still tucked in her sleeve, 6 charcoal words about the word for going home, and Alys sat with it until the lights along the corridor outside began their slow cycle toward the station's artificial dawn, and then she rose and washed her face and went to stand in the gallery, because there was, in the end, nothing left to decide that the last 3 days had not already decided for her. The morning of the 3rd renewal arrived on Calyx's reach with the specific brightness of a ceremonial deck lit at full output, every loom strip along the great assembly hall's arched ribs burning cold white, throwing long shadows from the assembled ranks of the court across polished decking that had been cleared, swept, and cleared again since before dawn. Bloodmarked filled the forward tiers in their glyph-bordered formal robes. Names stood the middle ranks in their sober working blues. Voiceless lined the walls at the very back and the very edges, silent, uncounted, present the way furniture is present. The Terran delegation occupied a narrow gallery to the side, granted visibility but no proximity, which Alys understood now, standing in the 3rd row beside Ambassador Dresden with her hands locked together hard enough to hurt, was itself the entire architecture of the message Vext intended to send. "Watch. Do not approach. This is not your order to question." Sael stood at the base of the dais with 2 other Voiceless flagged for lesser infractions, hands bound at the wrist with a simple restraint cord that would not have held against real force and did not need to, because no Voiceless on this station had ever once tried to break one, because everyone here had learned, the way water learns the shape of its container, that trying only ever made the ending worse. Alys had spent 3 sleepless nights running through every version of what she might do, and had arrived, by the morning of the ceremony, at no plan at all, only a single flat certainty sitting where a plan should have been. That when the moment came, she would not be standing in the gallery when it happened. The Chancellor's voice carried through the hall on the amplification lattice, opening the rite with the long, ornate cadence of 1100 years of ceremonial law, invoking the order of caste, the sanctity of the bloodline, the honor of the coming accord, and Alys heard almost none of it, because her entire attention had narrowed down to the small figure standing at the base of the dais with her chin level, and her eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd, the posture of someone who had decided, a long time ago, to meet this moment without flinching, because flinching was the one thing they had never managed to take from her. Empress Soreth sat the high seat above the dais in ceremonial white and gold, and to Alys, straining for any detail across the gallery's distance, her face looked like a mask carved by someone who had never learned the muscles underneath it. Warden Isren stepped forward with the correction blade, not a weapon of war, something older and plainer, a ritual instrument that had cut exactly this same shape of sentence 1100 years running, and read the charge aloud in the flat, practiced tone of a functionary who had read it 1,000 times before. Unauthorized literacy, voiceless designation Hearth 9, Annex 4, confirmed by inspection. Sael did not close her eyes. Alys was moving before she had finished deciding to move, which was, she understood later, the only reason she managed it at all, because if she had stopped to weigh it, Dresden's voice and Sael's voice, and every cold fact either of them had laid out over 3 days would have won, would have held her in her seat the way they had held 40,000 people in their seats through 1100 years of this exact scene, and instead her body simply went, down the gallery steps, past a guard whose hand closed on empty air a half-second too late, out across the open floor of the assembly hall where no guest species had ever once set foot uninvited, straight toward the dais, until she was standing between Sael and the blade with her arms out, and her chest heaving, and absolutely no plan at all beyond the fact that she was there. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room deciding how far to stand from a blast radius. It was the silence of 1100 years of unbroken order encountering, for the first time in living memory, a single small, unarmed foreign thing that had simply refused to stay where it was told. "Move," Warden Wren said, low, more confused than angry, because nothing in 1100 years of ritual had prepared him for this particular sentence to require improvisation. "No," Alys said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her almost as much as it surprised the room. "You'll have to go through me." "Threnn," Chancellor Vex's voice cut across the hall, sharp now, all the mild warmth gone out of it in an instant. "You are interfering with sovereign law. Step back, or you will be corrected alongside her, and your entire delegation with you when this accord dies on this floor." "Then let it die," Alys said, and heard, distantly, Ambassador Dresden's stricken sound from the gallery, and did not look back at him, because looking back would mean seeing exactly how much she was throwing away, and she could not afford to feel the weight of that yet. "I'm not moving. She's a person. She traced 6 letters because I taught her, because she wanted to know a word for going home. And if that's a crime here, then I'm guilty of it too, and you can correct both of us. But you are not doing it to her while I stand somewhere safe and watch." 2 guards moved on Vex's signal, closing from either side of the dais, and Alys felt Sael's bound hands press, awkward and urgent, against her back, not pulling her away. She understood in the half-second before the guards reached her, but bracing her, holding her upright. The way you brace someone you have already decided is not going to be the one who falls first. "Stop." The word cut across the hall from the high seat, and it was not loud, and it did not need to be, because 1100 years of ritual had trained every ear in that room to hear the Empress's voice the instant it moved. Empress Soreth Vantine stood. No sovereign of the Vantine line had risen from the high seat during a correction right in the recorded history of the Dominion, a fact that Every blood marked in the forward tiers understood in their bones before their minds had finished processing what they were seeing. And the sound that moved through the assembled court was not gasps, not murmurs, but something closer to a held breath released all at once, 1,100 years of unbroken silence cracking audibly down the middle. Vex's face, for the first time since Alys had glimpsed him from the gallery, showed something other than calm. "Majesty," he said, careful, urgent, "this is a matter of established law." "I am aware what it is a matter of, Chancellor." Sareth came down from the dais herself, past the frozen guards, past Vex's outstretched hand, until she stood at the foot of the steps looking at a Terran clerk with her arms still spread in front of a bound servant, both of them shaking, neither of them moving, and something in Sareth's chest, which had been held closed and level for 8 months of careful practiced stillness, cracked open along a line she had not known was there until this exact moment. She had spent 8 months being told, in every language the court had for it, what an Empress of the Vanting line does and does not do. She had never once in 8 months been shown what it looked like when someone with absolutely nothing to gain, no rank, no bloodline, no accounting ledger reason on any page anywhere in the Dominion, decided that a person with a number instead of a name was worth every single thing they had. "What is your name?" Sareth said to Alys in Threnn court formal, and then, seeing the flicker of incomprehension, repeated it in the flatter trade standard most guest species carried. "Alys Ferro," Alys said. Her voice cracked on the second word and she let it because there was nothing left to protect by pretending otherwise. "Liaison clerk, Terran compact." "Her name is Sael, not Hearth 9. Sael. Her mother gave it to her before the debt bond and no one here has ever once used it, and I would like the last thing she hears, if this is the day she dies, to be her own name instead of a number." The hall was absolutely silent. Alys was distantly aware that she had just said, in front of the entire assembled court of the Threnn Dominion, several things Ambassador Dresden had explicitly forbidden her from saying, and that the accord, and the fate of 40,000 Terrans scattered across Dominion space, might well be ending in this exact silence. And she found, standing in the wreckage of every careful warning she had been given, that she could not make herself regret it. Empress Sareth looked at Sael for a long moment, really looked, the way Alys understood, watching her, that this particular Empress had perhaps never once actually looked at a Voiceless in her entire life, because no one had ever taught her that looking was a thing that was allowed. "Sael," Sareth said, and it was the first time in the Dominion's recorded history that a reigning sovereign had spoken a voiceless servant's given name inside the walls of the assembly hall, and something in Sael's face, some final held-together thing, came apart, silent, controlled, the tears running without a single sound escaping her. "There will be no correction here," Sareth said, and turned to face the frozen warden, the frozen guards, the entire stricken court, and made herself say it loud enough to carry to the back tiers where the Voiceless stood along the wall, uncounted, present the way furniture was present, listening to a sentence none of them had ever expected to hear spoken by a crowned Vanting. "Release her. Release all 3 of them. This right is suspended." Warden Wren's hands did not move for a long moment, caught between 1,100 years of standing order and a sovereign's direct voice, 2 authorities he had never once in his career been forced to weigh against each other, and it was the second command, sharper, that finally broke the paralysis. "Now, Warden." He cut the restraint cord himself, and Sael's hands came free, and the 2 other Voiceless flagged beside her, an old man with a bent back who had been marked for a spilled ration tray, and a boy who could not have been more than 14, marked for nothing. Alys had ever learned the details of, stood in the sudden slack silence of a sentence that had, against every precedent either of them had grown up expecting, simply not happened. Somewhere in the back tiers, a single sound broke loose, wordless, half a sob and half something closer to a laugh, and then another, and then the whole rear wall of the hall was making a sound Alys had never once heard it make in 14 months, low and disbelieving and entirely alive. The private audience chamber Soreth commandeered for the aftermath was small, undecorated, chosen for speed rather than symbolism, and it filled within the hour with exactly the people who mattered, and exactly the tension Alys had known, standing frozen in front of the dais 20 minutes earlier, would follow her here regardless of how the next hour went. Ambassador Dresden arrived white-faced and said almost nothing, which Alys understood was its own kind of mercy, because anything he said in front of the Empress would become a matter of record, and he had spent 30 years learning not to hand anyone more record than they needed. Chancellor Vext arrived composed, which was worse, because composure from a man who had just watched 1100 years of unbroken precedent break in front of the entire court meant he had already begun calculating his next move before the doors had finished sealing. "Majesty," he said, before Soreth had even taken the single low seat the room offered, "I understand the impulse. It does you a certain credit in a private register, but you have just demonstrated, in front of the full court and a foreign delegation, that Vantane law bends for a Terran clerk's outburst. Every blood-marked house in this dominion runs its estates on voiceless labor. You have not shown mercy this morning. You have shown every one of them precisely how to force your hand." "I have shown them," Soreth said, and her voice, Alys noticed, had steadied considerably in the last hour, the way a hand steadies once it has finally, after years of practice, been permitted to do the one thing it was actually built for. "That I am capable of looking at what this order actually costs, instead of accepting the accounting someone else did for me before I could see the ledger myself. That is not the same thing as weakness, Chancellor, whatever you would prefer it to be called." "It is precisely the same thing my enemies will call it," Vext said, and for the first time something sharp slid under the careful courtesy of his voice. "And I would remind your Majesty that your enemies, and the enemies who took your mother from you, have not gone anywhere simply because you have ascended. This morning's spectacle has handed them a phrase to use against you that will follow you for the rest of your reign, the Empress who wept over a servant." "Then let them use it," Soreth said. "I would rather be remembered for that than for pretending, for the next 30 years, that I never noticed what my own order does to the people holding it up." "You speak as though 30 years of pretending were a choice available to any of us," Vext said, and for a moment the mask of careful courtesy slipped enough that Alys, watching from the doorway, glimpsed something underneath it that looked almost like fear. "I governed this dominion through your interregnum, Majesty. I held it together while the court whispered about who had poisoned your mother, and how easily the same hand might reach her daughter. I did that with the order you now propose to unmake in a single morning's outburst. The same order, the same blood-marked houses, the same careful, unglamorous machinery that has kept 1100 years of this dominion from tearing itself apart along 100 different fault lines. You inherited a throne that still stands, because people like me were willing to do the unglamorous, unpopular work of keeping it standing. I would ask you to consider, before you burn that machinery down over a single servant, whether you have anything ready to replace it with." "I have 3 days of ledgers," Soreth said, "that tell me the machinery you're so proud of keeping standing runs on debt bonds engineered never to close, and correction quotas dressed up as appropriate deference density, and 1100 years of blood-marked houses agreeing, quietly, never to ask what any of it actually costs the people underneath it. I do not have a replacement built yet, Chancellor. You are right about that. But I have watched, this week, what it looks like when someone with nothing at all decides a person is worth more than the machinery that says otherwise. I intend to build the replacement around that, one ledger at a time, for as long as it takes. You are welcome to help me build it. I would prefer that, honestly. You know these houses better than I do, and better than any council I could assemble from nothing. But I will not be told that the alternative to your order is chaos, when I have spent 3 days reading exactly how much quiet, ordered cruelty your order was already producing every single day, chaos or no chaos." Vext said nothing to that for a long moment, and something in his silence, Alys thought, watching from the doorway, was not agreement, and was not quite defeat either. It was the silence of a man recalculating fast, which doors were still open to him, and which had just quietly closed. She turned then to where Alys still stood near the door, unsure whether she was a guest in this room or a prisoner awaiting a second sentence, with Sael beside her, free of the restraint cord now, wrists raw where it had cut, standing straighter than Alys had ever seen her stand in a room where, for the first time in either of their lives, a sovereign of the Threnn Dominion was asking a question and actually waiting for the answer. "Why?" Soreth said simply. "You had every reason not to. Your ambassador will have told you exactly what you were risking. Tell me the truth, not the version that sounds good for the record." Alys thought about Dresden's careful warnings, about the 40,000 Terrans scattered across Dominion space whose fragile toehold she had just spent on the floor of an assembly hall, about every rehearsed diplomatic sentence she could have offered instead of the truth, and found, looking at Soreth's face, that the truth was the only thing left in her that had not already burned away. "Because she's a person," Alys said. "Not a servant, not a number. A person, and no one had ever once used her name, and I could not make myself sit in a gallery and watch that happen to someone She stopped, and made herself finish it, because she had come this far past every careful line already drawn for her. Someone I love, in whatever way you're allowed to love someone you've spent 11 months talking to for 6 minutes at a time in a bathroom, because that was the only place it was safe. I didn't have a plan. I didn't calculate the odds. I just could not let it happen while I had legs to walk down there and stand in front of it." The silence that followed held a different quality than the silence in the assembly hall had held, not the silence of 1100 years cracking, but something quieter, more private, a young Empress sitting with a sentence she had clearly never once, in her entire sheltered upbringing, heard spoken about anyone wearing a caste number. "My mother's court taught me," Soreth said finally, "that voiceless labor is a mercy in its way, that the caste order gives the numbered a place, a purpose, a household to belong to, in exchange for the freedoms they are unfit to carry unsupervised. I have believed that, more or less without examining it, for the entire 23 years of my life. I did not believe it 40 minutes ago, watching you stand in front of a blade for someone with no name anyone had bothered to learn. I am not certain I believe a single word of it now." "Majesty," Vexed began again, and Soreth held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped, which told Alys more about the shifting weight in that room than anything either of them had said aloud. "I have a renewal vote to reopen within the hour, Chancellor, and a court full of blood-marked houses waiting to see whether this morning was a moment of weakness or the beginning of something they will need to reckon with," Soreth said. "I intend for it to be the second thing. Leave me the chamber, all of you, except her." She looked at Sael. "I would like to hear from you what 11 corrections looked like from where you were standing. I find I have spent 23 years being taught everything about this order except that. What happened over the following 3 days did not, at first, look like the beginning of anything the historians who eventually wrote about it would call a turning point. It looked, from where Alys stood, confined, at Dresden's white-faced insistence, to the annex under a security hold pending diplomatic review, unable to leave, unable to see Sael, informed only through fragmentary cables that filtered up from Dresden's office, like a slow, agonizing waiting room, the kind that made a person's certainty about having done the right thing feel less like conviction, and more like a held breath that refused to release. She learned later, pieced together from Sael's own account, and from the fragments the court's own record eventually made public, what those 3 days had actually held. Soreth had spent them in the ledger rooms beneath the assembly hall, the ones that held the actual accounting of Dominion order rather than its ceremonial face. Household registries, debt bond contracts, correction logs stretching back generations, records that no reigning empress had apparently ever personally opened, because opening them had never once been required of a sovereign whose only job, as her mother's court had quietly understood it, was to preside over an order someone else had already finished designing. Sael had walked her through them, hour by hour, translating not language but practice. The debt bonds that renewed themselves automatically at terms no bonded servant could ever actually satisfy. The correction quotas certain households kept to maintain what the ledgers, in language so bureaucratic it took Soreth a full reading to understand what it was actually describing, called appropriate deference density. 1100 years of law, laid bare in its own numbers, describing a system built not around order at all in the end, but around fear kept at a specific, carefully calibrated temperature. On the second of those 3 nights, Sael found Soreth still in the ledger room past the hour any aide would have dared interrupt her, sitting on the floor between 2 towers of registry tablets with her formal robes discarded for a plain traveling coat, looking less like an empress than like a student who had discovered, too late in her education, how much of the syllabus she had never actually been taught. "This one," Soreth said, without looking up, holding out a tablet showing a household's annual accounting, "belongs to a house 4 systems from here. Look at the debt bond terms in the 3rd column." Sael crouched and read it slowly, sounding out the harder characters the way she still did when a document ran long. "The interest recalculates upward every renewal cycle," she said. "Faster than any wage the bond permits the servant to earn." "It is designed to," Soreth said. "I checked 11 other households tonight. Every one of them structures its bonds the same way. Not because 11 separate stewards independently arrived at the same clever arithmetic. Because it is standard practice, taught in the same administrative college that trained my own household stewards, in a course my mother's court would have called simply estate management." She set the tablet down and rubbed her eyes, and for a moment looked, Sael thought, considerably younger than 23. "I used to think correction was the cruelty in this system. I am beginning to understand it is only the enforcement mechanism. The actual cruelty is in these columns. It was here the entire time, dressed as arithmetic, and no one ever once asked me to read it." "Why are you asking me to help you read it now?" Sael said, "instead of a scholar or a counselor who has done this work for decades?" Soreth considered the question with the same careful attention she had been giving the ledgers all night. "Because a scholar would explain the numbers to me the way they have always been explained, as a regrettable but necessary feature of an old and stable order. You do not explain them to me that way. You read them like someone reading a map of every place she has ever been made to stand still and wait to be told what happens to her next. I find I trust that reading a great deal more than I trust the scholars." Sael did not answer that directly. She reached instead for the next tablet in the stack, and they worked through it together, hour by hour, long past the point where any of Soreth's aides would have thought to look for her. 2 women from opposite ends of a caste order neither of them had built, taking it apart 1 column at a time. Vexed in those same 3 days, had not been idle. Alys learned afterward, in fragments that made her hands go cold reading them, that the Chancellor had spent the 3 days the ledger rooms held Soreth's attention quietly assembling support among the blood-marked houses most heavily dependent on voiceless estates. A coalition, built fast and built ugly, prepared to force a vote of regency reconsideration on the grounds that an empress who wept publicly over a servant and spent 3 days reading household ledgers instead of attending to the renewal was demonstrably unfit to hold the throne alone. It was not, technically, a coup. The Dominion's ancient constitutional order permitted exactly this maneuver, on exactly these grounds, under exactly enough procedural cover that no one could later call it anything so crude as a seizure of power. It became one, on the night before the reconsideration vote was scheduled to be called, when the guards assigned to Soreth's private quarters were quietly reassigned, on Vext's authority as Chancellor, 6 hours before 3 men with blood-marked household colors and no names on any duty roster, attempted to enter those quarters through a maintenance access that should not have existed on any schematic Sareth's own security detail had been shown. It was Sael who found the discrepancy. She had spent 11 months learning to be invisible in exactly the way the Threnn caste order demanded of her, moving through service corridors and maintenance grates that no bloodmarked ever thought to look at twice. And in the 3 days since the assembly hall, moving now with an Empress's provisional protection instead of a household collar, she had kept moving through those same corridors out of a habit 11 years old, and had seen. In the access logs of a maintenance junction 2 decks below Sareth's quarters, an authorization stamp that did not match any schedule she recognized, timestamped for that same night, 6 hours out. She could not read the technical registry codes well enough. 11 months of stolen letters not yet equal to a lifetime of engineering literacy, but she recognized enough of the shape of it to know it was wrong, and she ran, not to a guard, because she did not yet trust which guards answered to whom, but to the one person on the station who had already proven, on a dais in front of the entire court, that she would move first and calculate the cost after. Alys was still under security hold in the annex, unreachable through any channel Sael had clearance to use, and so Sael did the only thing left to her. She went to Ambassador Dresden's office directly, alone, a voiceless servant with no standing to be anywhere near a diplomatic annex without an escort, and she stood in his doorway shaking and said, in halting trade standard, 6 words that undid 30 years of Dresden's careful policy of never involving the compact in Dominion internal matters. They are going to kill her tonight. Dresden broke every rule of compact non-interference he had spent 3 days furiously reminding Alys to observe, and did it inside 11 minutes, because it turned out in the end that the difference between the rule he had defended and the choice Alys had made on the dais was smaller than he had let himself believe. He released Alys from the security hold on his own authority, requisitioned the compact's small diplomatic security detachment, 6 people, unarmed by treaty except for the ceremonial sidearms no one had ever expected to actually draw, and sent an emergency cable, coded and direct, to the one Threnn officer he knew personally still loyal to the Vanting line rather than to whichever faction currently held the ledgers. The Reach's own station master, a named officer named Corin Vale, who had spent 11 months quietly resenting Vex's overreach into station security, without ever having a reason strong enough to act on it. Alys ran the entire route from the annex to Sareth's private quarters with Sael beside her, both of them moving through service corridors Sael knew from 11 years of invisibility, and Alys knew from 3 days of desperate memorization of every schematic Dresden's office had access to. And they reached the maintenance junction 2 decks below Sareth's quarters with barely 4 minutes to spare. The junction itself was a narrow steel throat between 2 pressure seals, lit by a single amber service loom, and Alys understood the instant she saw it that there was no version of this where she and Sael physically stopped 3 armed men with nothing but their own bodies. What there was, instead, was a control panel bolted beside the inner seal, its casing scuffed from decades of maintenance crews who had never once needed to use it for anything more urgent than a coolant leak, and a single manual override lever beneath a warning placard in Threnn script that Sael read aloud, fast, breathless, before Alys' eyes had even finished tracking the words. Fire suppression failsafe. It seals the junction from both sides. It will not open again without a station master's authorization code. Will it hold against them? It is built to hold against a hull breach, Sael said. It will hold against 3 men with hand weapons for as long as the seal itself lasts, which is longer than we need it to. They heard the men before they saw them, boots on decking 2 turns down the corridor, unhurried, confident, the sound of people who had never once had to imagine this particular door working against them. And Alys threw her whole weight against the override lever, a bare 15 seconds before the first of them rounded the corner into the amber light. The seal came down with a shriek of decompression alarms and a slam that Alys felt in her teeth, and on the other side of 8 centimeters of Dominion hull-grade steel, she heard a fist strike the door once, hard, and a voice she did not recognize swear in a Threnn dialect too fast and too furious for her limited vocabulary to follow. They did not wait to see whether the seal would hold. They ran the rest of the way to Sareth's quarters by the long route, the one that did not pass back through the junction, and reached the outer chamber 6 minutes later to find Station Master Vale's security detail already moving through the corridor ahead of them at a dead run, cutting the distance the sealed junction had bought into exactly enough time. The 3 men were taken alive, which mattered less, in the record that eventually got written, than what was taken from them. A private cable, on one man's person, bearing Chancellor Vex's own household seal, authorizing what its careful phrasing called *A necessary correction to an unstable succession. Language, Sareth would later observe with a coldness that surprised even the court members who thought they knew her, remarkably similar to the language used to authorize the correction of a servant for tracing 6 letters into dust. The renewal ceremony reconvened 4 days later than scheduled, in the same assembly hall, under the same cold white loom strips, before a court that had spent 4 days learning, in fragments and rumors, and finally in the full formal charge sheet Sareth ordered read aloud in open session, exactly how close their new Empress had come to dying in a maintenance corridor on the authority of the man who had governed them through her ascension. Chancellor Doran Vex stood in the same forward tier where he had once stood beside the throne, under formal arrest, stripped of his seal of office, and said nothing throughout the reading of the charge, because there was, in the end, nothing left to say that the intercepted cable had not already said for him. Sareth did not begin with the accord. 1100 years ago, she said, standing where her mother had once stood, where her mother's mother had stood before that, the founding charter of this dominion set down an order of caste that its authors called eternal, unchangeable, woven into the structure of the universe as surely as gravity. I have spent the last 4 nights reading the actual ledgers that order produces, not the charter's language but its arithmetic, correction quotas, deference density calculations. Debt bonds engineered never to close. I did not find eternal order in those pages, court. I found fear, administered on a schedule, to keep a portion of this dominion's people small enough to control and cheap enough to use. The silence in the hall this time was not the cracking silence of a broken precedent. It was the silence of several thousand people realizing, in real time, which direction a sovereign's next sentence was about to travel. 4 days ago on this floor, a Terran clerk with no rank and nothing to gain crossed a boundary no one has ever been permitted to cross, to stand between a blade and a servant whose name no record in this dominion had ever bothered to hold. She had no power to back that choice. She had only the choice itself. I have since learned that same servant's quick thinking, 3 nights ago, is very likely the reason I am alive to stand here and say any of this to you at all. I would like the court to sit with that fact for a moment. The order we have called eternal for 1100 years produced a person with no legal standing whatsoever to save the life of her own sovereign, and would, under that same order's own written law, have executed her 4 days earlier for the crime of learning to read. She let that sit, and Alys, standing again in the gallery beside a stricken, silent Ambassador Dresden, felt something in her chest that had been clenched shut since the moment she stepped onto that dais finally, slowly, begin to loosen. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that changing 1100 years of order is a thing accomplished by a single ceremony, Sareth said. It is not. There are houses in this court who will lose fortunes built on voiceless labor, and I do not intend to pretend that loss is nothing, or that it will be accepted without a fight I expect to occupy a great deal of my reign. But I am the sovereign of this dominion, and by the same ancient law that permits me to renew this accord today, I am entitled to speak a blood-name oath, an oath that, once spoken before this court and carried on the Threnn lattice to every world under Vanting authority, cannot be rescinded except by a sovereign of equal standing to my own. I intend to speak one now." She turned deliberately to the court recorder's station, where the ceremonial broadcast lattice stood ready to carry her words to every world, station, and household under Dominion authority, the same network that had, 4 days ago, been prepared to carry the image of a servant's correction as a demonstration of unbroken order. By the authority of the Vanting line, and by blood-name oath before this court and this Dominion, I declare the caste designation of Voiceless abolished, effective from this hour on every world under Dominion authority. Every servant currently bound under debt bond or household registry is, as of this oath, a named citizen of the Dominion, entitled to wages, to education, to the right to a name of their own choosing recorded in law. I am aware this cannot be accomplished in a single afternoon. I am ordering, effective immediately, the formation of a transition council, seated with equal voice from blood-marked, named, and formerly voiceless representatives, to oversee the process, and I am naming, as its first named appointee, a servant this court knew 4 days ago only as Hearth 9, and who I have had the privilege of knowing this week as Sael. The sound that moved through the assembly hall then was not silence at all. It broke from somewhere in the back tiers, where the voiceless, who would not, by the letter of Sareth's own oath, be voiceless by the time the sound had finished traveling the length of the hall, stood along the wall, uncounted, present the way furniture had always been present, and it started as a single voice and became, within seconds, a sound Alys had never heard inside that hall in 14 months of keeping her head down and walking past bells. The sound of people who had spent their entire lives being furniture, discovering all at once that the room had just agreed to see them. The third renewal of the Calyx Accord passed, in the end, by a wider margin than any renewal in the Compact's 14 years of standing in Threnn space, and the cable Ambassador Dresden sent home to the Compact Chancellery that night, the one Alys was shown, months later, framed and hung in the Annex lobby, as a kind of quiet apology for every warning he had given her, described the vote's result in a single line before spending 4 pages describing everything that had happened around it. Accord renewed unanimously. Recommend full historical review. The standing of this office in Threnn space has, effective this week, fundamentally changed, and not for reasons any prior briefing prepared us to expect. What followed in the months after did not resolve cleanly, because 1100 years of order does not unmake itself in a single blood-name oath, no matter how binding its law considers that oath to be. 3 blood-marked houses attempted, in the reconsideration process that followed, to challenge the abolition's legality on procedural grounds, and lost, because the oath's own ancient mechanism, the same mechanism that had once been designed to protect a sovereign's authority from being undone by anyone weaker than herself, turned out to work exactly as well protecting the powerless as it had ever protected the powerful. Reports reached Calyx Reach over the following year, of unrest on a dozen worlds where local governors resisted the Transition Council's authority, of estates that quietly continued old practices under new names until the Council's inspectors caught up with them, of the slow, uneven, genuinely difficult work of turning a proclamation into a lived fact across an empire that spanned more worlds than any single council could watch at once. It was not, Alys understood, watching it unfold from the narrow vantage of one small annex on one small station, a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning, messy and contested and real, which was, she had come to think, the only kind of ending actually worth having. Other empires along the Dominion's borders watched, and reacted in their own ways, some with quiet alarm at a precedent that might reach their own bonded populations, some with cautious diplomatic feelers testing whether a Dominion suddenly rewriting its oldest law might also be a Dominion suddenly open to renegotiating older grievances. The Terran compact zone standing across Dominion space shifted in ways no one at the Annex had predicted or planned for. Not because Earth had done anything in the end, but because one of its clerks had, and because the story of what she had done, retold, reshaped, half mythologized within a season became, across 100 worlds that had never once had reason to think about humans before, the first thing anyone knew about the species at all. The Transition Council held its first formal session 6 weeks after the renewal, in a chamber that had been, until that year, a records archive no one important had bothered to visit. Sael sat at a long table between a blood-marked estate holder who had opposed the abolition to the last procedural motion available to him, and a named labor registrar who had spent a career quietly documenting the very abuses the council now existed to unwind, and read aloud, in a voice that had grown steadier every week since the assembly hall, the first formal registry of freed citizens from the Calyx district. 311 names, some chosen fresh. Some recovered from mothers and fathers, who had kept them the way Sael's own mother had kept hers, spoken and unspoken through years of bond and collar. Alys stood in the gallery for that reading, off duty, off the clock, there because Sael had asked her to be, and watched 311 people who had spent their lives being furniture hear their names read into a permanent record for the first time, and understood that this, more than the dais, more than the blood-name oath, was the actual shape of the thing they had started. Alys stayed on Calyx Reach 11 more months, past the point where Dresden quietly offered to arrange her transfer home with her record intact and her career, against every early prediction, entirely undamaged. She stayed because Sael, seated now on the Transition Council with a title and a salary, and a small quarters of her own 2 decks above the Annex, had asked her to, in the careful, deliberate way Sael did everything now that no one was watching to punish her for it. They did not talk, in the end, about what to call what had grown between them over 11 months of 6-minute lessons in a locked refresher, and one impossible morning on an assembly hall floor. It did not need a name any more than Sael's own name had needed anyone's permission to exist. It simply was, the way a thing that survives the worst version of itself simply is, quiet and steady and entirely its own, and on the evening Alys finally did transfer home, a year and 4 months after the day she had stopped keeping walking, Sael stood with her at the docking gate in a named citizen's plain blue coat with her own name stitched, small and unremarkable and entirely legal, into the collar, and did not say goodbye because it was not, either of them had already quietly decided. Actually goodbye. Send word, Sael said, when you land. So I know the word for going home worked both directions. I will, Alys said, and meant it, and somewhere behind them, through the Annex's viewport, Calyx Reach turned slowly against the dark, a small station on the edge of a dominion that had, in the space of one very long morning, begun the long, unglamorous, unfinished work of learning to see the people who had always been holding it up,